Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 264 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is James Patrick Kelly. He's published over 100 short stories, which have received numerous awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Award. Together with John Kessel, he's edited anthologies such as Feeling Very Strange, the Slipstream Anthology, Rewired, the Post-Cyberpunk Anthology, and Digital Rapture, the Singularity Anthology. He also writes a column about the internet for Asimov's Magazine, and is on the faculty of the Stone Coast Creative Writing MFA program at the University of Southern Maine. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new novel, Mother Go, and his new short story collection, The Promise of Space. And now, here's our interview with James Patrick Kelly. All right, so we're here with James Patrick Kelly. Welcome to the show.
I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, and so your new novel is called Mother Go. So how'd this book come about?
It's a long story. I guess the way to start is to say it's been a long time since I published a novel. I published several novels back before the turn of the century. Oh my God, that is ancient history. And I thought they were good. They got some attention. But one of the things that happened was a couple of them were what some people laughingly call fix-up novels. And that is to say that some of the pieces of those novels were published as stories before they were collected into the novel form. And so my last novel, proper novel, was called Wildlife, and it collected a bunch of stories, some of which are some of my best-known stories. But which, as I was writing the stories, I had designed it all to go together. And yeah, so I published this fix-up novel, and it got some nice reviews. But it also got reviews that said, oh, well, this is just a fix-up novel. And so like, oh dear, that's sort of not really a novel, is it? So I sort of vowed to myself, I did not sort of vow, I vowed to myself I would write a novel. My next novel would be a straight-up novel, no excerpts, no nothing. And so I made that vow, and 20-some years later, there was no novel. I had a novel that I started, and it's odd. It's the only thing, a major work of mine that I've not finished, that I don't know if I've abandoned it or not, but I haven't worked on it in a long time. But as I was, about 10 years ago, I was writing these stories, and I wrote a story, got very well received. It was called Going Deep. It was in Best of the Year, and it got a Nebula nomination. And it's ended up short of resolution. I had a resolution of the story, but there was more to come. And so I wrote another story using the same character, Mariska Volochkova, and that story was very well received. It was in all the Best of the Years. It was nominated for both of the awards. I don't have a winner from either one of those, but nonetheless, it was a well-received story, and it got me thinking, well, that story wasn't really, her Mariska's story was not yet concluded. And so I decided to break my vow and to write a fix-up novel. And so that's how this came about. Some fraction of this book has been published as short stories, and I would say about I don't know, maybe a third of it was previously published, and the other 2/3 is new to the book. And so that's how it came about, and it was sort of a struggle because I wasn't really sure I wanted to do that. I realized I had said I wasn't going to do it anymore, but the stories were so compelling to me. I really wanted to explore and find out what happened to Mariska. So there it was. I wrote a novel, a fix-up novel, a braided novel, whatever you want to call it. Let's call it. And there has been a movement because lots of people have done it. There's a long history of novels that had pieces published independently as short stories. Some of our best novels, Ted Sturgeon wrote one, More Than Human. Joe Haldeman wrote The Forever War. And not to mention the fact that Scott Card wrote Ender's Game first as a story. And so there's been, this is not a new thing. but it does have sort of the whiff of, oh, I don't know what the critical response is. Oh, he's double dipping, or, oh, it's not really a novel because it wasn't constructed as a novel. But I decided just to push back against that and go and do what I want to do anyway. So that's what I've done.
Yeah, no, I'll just say I loved this book. I thought it was fantastic, and I like fix-up novels in general. I mean, like you mentioned, Orson Scott Card had another one called The Worthing Saga that I read as a kid that was a fix-up novel. I mean, right. Foundation, Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang. I mean, I think it's really good in a way because I read so many novels and so many of them have this very predictable structure, this very predictable climax and movement and everything. And when you have something built out of these different stories, it feels more like real life to me, these sort of weird eddies and currents, and it just has a more textured feel to it.
Well, thank you. And you know what? Here's the other thing. I mean, so I can make an aesthetic argument in that it is a way to break the 3-act formula. If you're writing a fix-up novel, lots of times those stories don't fall neatly into the 3-act kind of structure that so many other books do. Not to say there's anything wrong with the 3-act, but if you're looking for something that's a little bit different, I think a fix-up novel often delivers that kind of experience, reading experience.
Yeah. Well, and another thing I thought was really interesting about this book is that it's part of what almost feels like a movement of books that are kind of acknowledging that it's not easy to get from one planet to another one.
Yeah.
Like Leviathan Awakes or Kim Stanley Robinson's 2312 or Aurora. Did you see this as kind of part of that sort of movement or whatever?
Yeah. Well, so Stan Robinson is a really good friend of mine, and I've been following his career since forever, since we both basically broke in about the same time. And I was very taken with 2312. I had already written the Moon story, the Mariska on the Moon, her youngest years. And I was thinking about Mars. I had never written a Mars story. So 2312 was a big influence. Then when I heard he was writing a Starship story, I said, uh-oh, I better not read that. And I still have not read Aurora. So I've skipped Aurora and I'm reading the Drowned New York novel actually. So, but yeah, I think this is something that's, it's worth talking about. It is controversial. I mean, the bones of science fiction are based on space opera, faster than light travel, galactic empires, and that's all well and good. But, when you think seriously about some of this stuff, absent a faster than light wormhole kind of a conceit, or more likely not a conceit, a possibility of hibernation, there's really no way to get to the stars. And so all this galactic stuff is kind of fantasy. Oop, did I just say that? No, blip that out. No, I mean that. I mean, I think that people who are seriously writing hard science fiction know that as well. So there's hand waving and all of a sudden we're going faster than the speed of light. And, in my book, I posit these possibly imaginary builders who have built a one-way, a wormhole from the Oort cloud to the center of a very rich stellar environment full of stars and planets, a galaxy millions of light years away, just sort of to get as a story engine to get this going. But I totally agree that there's no need for me to agree. The physics of it says it's a long way to Mars. It's an even longer way to the asteroid belt. And oh my God, the Oort cloud is like impossibly far away. So this kind of science fiction, it seems to me anyway, for serious writers who are trying to play with the, as Gregory Benford says, with the tennis net up. When they write hard science fiction, they're trying to play by the rules. It's really hard to take seriously some of that faster than light stuff.
Well, you mentioned hibernation, so why don't you tell us a little bit about Mariska, because hibernation is a big part of her life.
Mm-hmm. So Mariska is the clone of a Starship officer, a medical officer. And I came up with sort of a hybrid starfaring technology, and that is, so the edge of the wormhole is in the Oort cloud, and it's a long way, even with the technology we have in the 150 years from now. So they cold sleep to get to the wormhole. Then there's a transit time within the wormhole, and then there's more transit outside when they get to the other galaxy and go looking for planets to colonize. So they have two kinds of hibernation technologies in my future. One of them is the kind that Mariska uses. Mariska and her mother, Natalia, have been genetically tweaked. This is very much a post-human future, although it's certainly a mix of people who have been tweaked and people who are what we might call standard human. But so they've been tweaked so that they can hibernate more or less at will, although it's always dangerous. And hibernation is very dangerous in my future. But they are the natural people to be the crew of a starship. And then there's also induced hibernation from standard people like you and I. And that's dangerous as well. They need to have elaborate technology, and there is a small but not insignificant risk of brain damage when you hibernate, both for the natural hibernators or the genetically altered hibernators like Mariska, and for the standard hibernators who use the hibernation cold sleep technology. So it's fraught with danger to do this, and lots of science fiction is about how, the technology goes wrong. And so it's not really interesting technology. But I think more interesting is the technology works just fine, but there is a risk in using it. And so this is sort of my idea behind hibernation. So Mariska has been cloned, but Mom basically never saw Mariska. She had Mariska conceived, and then Mariska was brought to term in an artificial womb and brought up by a rent-a-dad, a hired father. And so when Natalia comes back from her last Starship jaunt, which not coincidentally, has discovered a planet that's worth colonizing, she comes back and says, "Hey, Mariska, we're going to the stars." Mariska is 14 years old, lives on the moon, has a boyfriend, is going to, is going to high school. She's training to be a spacer, but not in any serious way. And all of a sudden, Mom comes home and says, "You're going to the stars." And like any teenager, especially a teenager who has no emotional connection to this person who is her scare quotes mother, but who in fact has never done anything for her other than provide her genetic pattern, she rebels and does some very, she basically runs away from home, but in a very science fictional way.
Well, right. So you say that she was tweaked. So she's been tweaked with quote unquote ground squirrel transgenes.
Yeah. And so, there is we do know that there are hibernators, and there are very successful hibernators. Now, there's a little hand wavy thing going on here where I'm positing that, the same systems that allow a ground squirrel to hibernate may be transferable and useful for humans. Yeah. The ground squirrel phenomenon and other hibernation phenomena exist in real life. And there is chemistry and biology that have been studied about how it works. So, but there's absolutely no way we know how to do this so that to genetically modify humans. But on the other hand, it's 150 years in the future. Give me a break. This is within the purview of science fiction extrapolation. And when it's proved wrong, I'll be long dead unless I'm hibernating and on my way to the stars. I don't know. But yeah. So that's the theory of it. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous to be used. And also, the story sort of glosses over this, but does nod in the direction of some of the early genetically tweaked hibernators did not fare so well. And so, and in some ways, this is what this story, part of what this story is about is, who is it? Who is it? What kind of person is it who goes to space? Not just for the glory of it, but who is it that is going to get on a starship and leave Earth forever to found a colony? Who is it that decides to have themselves tweaked or cloned or whatever in order to go to space? It's not the argument of the book. I think the argument that I would make is that it's a small fraction of people. So these are unique people who are risk takers and not always the smart. They don't always take risks in the smartest way. But nonetheless, it is a question that is at the heart of this book for me anyway. Is so. How do we look at the explorers? How do we look at the extraordinary people? Are they better than us? Are they super people? Are they foolish? And I think the book asks these questions again and again and again, like, what is it that motivates these exceptional people? And exceptional is not always a term of approbation. Sometimes exceptional people are not to be looked up to.
I was curious because in the book, Mariska can just sort of will herself into hibernation. And I guess I never really thought about it before, but is that how it works with ground squirrels, that they choose that it's time to hibernate now?
Well, I've done extensive research with the ground squirrel community, and they report, I don't know. I believe that it's a seasonal thing, so that they are, as the days get shorter, their biology clicks in, and as they become more lethargic, they use less energy, and so their cells start manufacturing the hormones that allow them to do this. No, so I mean, I don't think that on July 4th, a squirrel would be freaked out by the fireworks going on. Will hibernate through to July 29th to make sure that they don't have to listen to it. I think it's totally beyond their control, their conscious control.
Interesting. I also wanted to ask you about, there's another character who's been genetically tweaked in this book, Elon the Martian. Could you talk about him?
So this is a genetic tweaking future, a post-human future. And so, and here I'm tipping my hat to the late, great Fred Pohl. Elon has been genetically tweaked to survive for a brief time, but on the surface of Mars, but being able to survive on the surface of Mars is also a survival attribute for living on Mars for a long time. So he is, of course, I'm interrogating a a science fiction cliche because Elon is green. He's green. But he's green because he's photosynthetic. He has been tweaked so that he can receive energy from the sun and transform it for metabolic purposes. And so he has other tweaks as well. One of the tweaks he has is that in order for him to have enough surface area, photosynthetic surface area, to actually make a difference, he has a row of nodules on his shoulders that when he is in sunlight and at rest, they expand. Blood rushes to them and they unfold, and so they're sort of like fleshy straps, sort of like, not quite like palm leaves, but they're I don't know if you've ever seen the notorious houseplant mother-in-law's tongue, Sansevieria. It's long, strappy, sword-like leaves. That's what these things unfold from his shoulders and become solar collectors for his photosynthetic uses. And so The other thing about him that is the tweak that's sort of it's a PG-13 tweak, and that is that his sexual organs are retracted into his body cavity unless he's having sex, and this is to protect him from the radiation of Mars and from other things, and so. As a result of this, the rumor about Martian men is that they are somewhat less sexually aggressive, and if you want to get it on with a Martian guy, you of whatever gender you are, you need to make the first move. They are receivers and not senders.
Right now, when you say that's a nod to Fred Pohl, is that Man Plus? Is that the
absolutely?
Yeah.
Yep. Oh yeah. I remember reading. Oh gosh, I remember reading Man Plus when I was but a child, and I was like totally blown away by it. And I hadn't actually. I'm not sure. I have a pretty good sense of the history of science fiction, but I'm not sure exactly when it was that people started thinking about tweaking the human body genetically. But Fred Pohl's Man Plus hit me right between the eyes. Like, holy smokes, that could happen. And the opening of that book, I actually reread it, right before I decided to create Elan. And Fred's take on it was, of course, Elan is a second generation Martian, so he hasn't had this, but Fred's take on it was that the, genetic tweaking was no fun whatsoever. And also, Fred's Man Plus guy, I forget his name now, was a cyborg. In part because he not only was tweaked, but he also had mechanisms, devices that were helping him survive on the surface of Mars. But running around on the surface of Mars is kind of cool. We know what we know that Fred didn't know when he wrote Man Plus is that you're looking like it's like you running around on the surface of Mars is a little bit like running through Chernobyl. But still, it's a very cool thing. And so, it manages to recapture some of the sense of wonder about Mars that, as for instance, Bradbury's people go walk around in Mars on shorts. Well, of course, that's not going to happen. But even people who wrote more seriously about the Martian environment imagine that we could walk around on the surface. And actually, the surface of Mars is pretty much a killing zone for us. We'd have to be underground, or else altered, or else incredibly shielded in order to survive there.
Yeah. All right. So one thing I think is really, really interesting about this book is that it talks about the politics of launching a Starship, right? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, this is, it's a truism that the field doesn't acknowledge, that very few, if any, science fiction writers have any idea of economics. And so the whole idea that you could build a starship that would use the most, in my future, we've mastered the technology of antimatter. But antimatter is not going to be cheap, no matter how well we develop our technology. It's going to be a cost-intensive process to create antimatter. I'm not sure that any economies of scale are going to make it like driving down to the local antimatter station and filling up your flying car with antimatter. That's never going to happen. And so, I sort of posit that in the future, the antimatter market is something like the oil market or the energy, the hydrocarbon market now. And so who controls the antimatter has huge political say. Well, a bunch of, pie in the sky, explorer types have decided to build this humongous starship, 500 people, going through the wormhole to colonize another planet and never come back. That's the expenditure of, it's like if you took, 40 international space stations and shot them through the wormhole and never got your money back from them. And so I think the Starship Natividad has been under construction for a long time, and it's always been a controversial project. And so, as it nears completion, the powers that control the antimatter, which include several Earth powers, several planet powers, the Moon, Mars, Titan, the Belters, and some habitats, sort of say, "Oh, well, wait a minute, what are we getting for this again? Oh, sense of wonder. Mankind must expand, but how do you put a dollar sign on that?" And so, as the Starship gets closer to being completed, there is a rebellion in basically the UN of my future, the world, the Council of 10, which sort of runs the show, saying, we're not going to send that Starship away. That's like taking, $1 billion and burning it. We're never going to see any return from that. It's not like we're going to see new technology. They're going to take the technology out of the solar system, all those smart people out of the solar system, the antimatter out of why are we doing this? Somebody explain this to us again. And so, the conservatives, I hesitate to call them Republicans, but the conservatives of the future have decided to kill the Starship program, except it's controversial. They can't just say, well, we spent all that money for nothing. So they concoct a scheme to make it less likely that the crew and the colonists will want to go through the wormhole because it will become more dangerous, less likely to succeed. And so they're sort of basically shortchanging the project in the hopes that it will fail. And so, yeah, so there's obviously in any political system set in the solar system, there's going to be different factions. So the inner planets are sort of the fat cats sitting on the economy as it exists now and controlling the antimatter, and the outer planets, the Belters and Titan, are more interested in expanding and also wresting control of the antimatter economy from the inner planet. So there's a political factions going back and forth, and the Starship becomes the pawn between this power struggle between the inner planets and the outer worlds.
Yeah, and as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, this is definitely what would happen in this situation. And I mean, do you see this is just going to be a huge problem if humanity ever wants to launch a Starship? Or is there anything we can, seems like we just need to turn the whole planet into science fiction fans in order for anything like this to ever happen?
Well, it sort of leaves out it's a novel. My novel is a novel. I can't put everything in that I think. But one of the things I think is that the galactic cosmic radiation of being exposed in a starship, even a well-shielded starship, is such that it probably is really a problem to send some ship, whether you're going faster than the speed of light somehow, or more likely to be hibernating your way to the stars. You're going to be exposed to galactic cosmic radiation for decades, and that isn't good for you. So my own thought is, and nobody wants this except cyberpunks and wackos, is that, I sort of believe in Charlie Strauss's idea that, the future of space travel is we will download ourselves into Coke cans in size spaceships and shoot off, to wherever we're going over incredibly long periods of time. And then when we get to where we're going, our consciousnesses uploaded into these tiny little starships will do whatever we wanted to do when we get there. Now, but it begs the question, why are we going to the stars again? Some people say, Stephen Hawking says we need to get off the planet because we're toasting this world. And so that's why we're going to the Mars. That's why we're going, that's why we need to go to another solar system someday to find an Earth, because Mars is not Earth. Mars needs to be terraformed to even come close to being, the desert. So that's what we need to do, is need to get in starships, and so humanity will continue to exist. And so, yeah, I'm behind that, but is that really what people are Joe Sixpack, Joe Netflix is going to want to spend his money on to make sure that, some future generation is going to, have a happy life on some world going around Tau Ceti while the Earth, is in galactic climate. Apocalyptic climate collapse. I just don't know about, what the rationale is for that whole notion that we have to get on an ark and go elsewhere to save humanity. I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense.
Well, but sooner or later, a gamma ray burster is going to fry the Earth, or in the long term, the sun's going to expand and fry the Earth, right? So at some point, we need to get off the Earth if humanity is going to survive.
Sure, we do. But yeah. The thing is that we have sort of, and I think this to come back to the book, the book is making the point that we're on the cusp in this book, as we are at the moment, of taking control of evolution and deciding, what is humanity? What does it mean to be human? That's, I have a whole collection of short stories coming out as well, which sort of interrogate this question. What does it mean to be human? So, does it mean that you have to have 2 arms, 2 legs, and eyes and ears, and you have to be, taller than 5 feet and shorter than 7 feet? Or does it mean that you have a consciousness, and that you can appreciate Beethoven and Shakespeare and Mark Rothko, even if there's no body that's doing it, if it's somehow consciousness? I think that the idea that we need to get humanity off the planet so we can get to some Eden planet, where our flesh bodies can live, is not paying attention to the kinds of things that are happening all around us, which maybe not necessarily in the near future, but inevitably will change who we are. And so this whole notion of what a person in 2017 thinks is human may be sort of laughably archaic in the time period of 2165 when this book takes place, much less in 3165. They may say, you had bodies then? What was that about? You had the same body? You died? Come on. What was those poor people back in 2017? What were they thinking?
Well, right. And I want to get to the short story collection in just a bit. I was just curious, though, about assuming we are going to have bodies colonizing planets, you say that the minimum viable population would be 462. I was just curious of how much science there is behind that.
Some, but not a whole lot. You'll note that there are, I forget how many, but a lot of, one of the things about the Starship that the colonists and the crew is that they're predominantly women. There's, I believe it's 70% women, 30% men. So there are also, one of Mariska's job is being in charge of the cold sleep team. And so she's in charge of the hibernators. She's also in charge she's in charge of some fraction of the hibernators, of the animals that they're bringing. We can't bring all the domestic animals that we currently use. But there also is, forget what it is, 10,000 straws of sperm donation, so that some of the women would not. The whole idea of this colony is not going to work under the Western tradition of one man, one woman, one family, and kids. It's going to be massive. The women are going to have to bear some of the children, and some of the children are going to come from sperm donation. So, yeah, that's the fudge factor. How long, and how diverse those sperm donations can make the rest of the population. The research into the first humans suggests that the tribe of Homo sapiens had a catastrophic tragedy about whatever it was, 50,000 years ago, and was decimated down to almost a handful, and then regenerated from that. So that's sort of my hand-wavy answer. whether it's true or not, I don't know. Like I say, it's science fiction.
Well, it also seems like if you're good enough at tweaking people's genes, you don't need that much genetic diversity in your initial population because you can fix problems as they arise.
Yeah, there's that too. I mean, the book doesn't overtly suggest that, but clearly, since they've been tweaking Martians and hibernators, they have that technology to do it. It's probably pretty expensive, and it's probably, as I say, it's probably dangerous. Nonetheless, once you get it done, those tweaks can be passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah. So another interesting thing about this book is that it's audiobook only. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So I have I've always loved reading my own work. And I used to, when I used to go, you probably have had this problem too. If you go and do a public reading someplace, or an appearance, people want to say, we'd love to buy your book. Well, what does your book cost? $25, $30, $40? You know, there's some people who are coming out to hear you who are interested, but not $30 worth of interested in your career. So what I used to do was record stories, and then depending on the audience, if it was a small town library, I might actually give the CDs away of me reading a story. Or if it was a more prosperous and larger venue, I might sell these CDs. And so I had this huge backlog of stories that I had recorded. When I published my novella Burn in 2005, it was from a wonderful small press called Tachyon. And as I got done with that book, I said, "Oh my God, this is some of my best work, and it's going to be in a small press. I love Tachyon, but they're not going to publish how many copies. How are people going to find out about this?" So I proposed to Jacob Weisman that I would podcast that book on publication, a chapter a week for 14 weeks. And he scratched his head but very generously agreed to that. And so that sort of made my career in many ways as a podcaster, because I did that. And back in those days, because I had the technology from selling those CDs and making those CDs, I was able to do a pretty good job, and I'm a pretty good reader. So when I did that, that particular book had 20,000 downloads, because back then, no award-winning, not that I'm a big name, but no middle name science fiction writer had ever done a podcast like that and given away something for free. Cory Doctorow was doing it. But anyway, I was right on Cory's heels. So anyway, 20,000 people downloaded that book, and it was a huge success, and it won the Nebula Award. And so at the Nebula Awards, a guy from Audible came up, Steve Feldberg, and said, "Hey, kid," he's probably the same age as I am, but he said, "Hey, we love that book. How would you like to have it on Audible?" I said, "Steve, I recorded that in my closet." He said, "Nah, it's fine. It's at least as good as some of the stuff we've got up there." And so he cut a deal where, in the aftermath of that award, I recorded 52 of my stories myself and posted them on Audible. So that was the start of a beautiful and long friendship with Audible. So they've also published 2 of my previous novels, my older novels, my middle-aged novels. And so when Steve found out that I was getting close to finishing Mother Go, he made a very attractive offer, and we went back and forth with my agent, and finally we decided, yeah, okay, let's do this. It probably isn't going to, it's a deal where it's a hard sell to do some for science fiction. I think it's a harder sell than it used to be to sell a science fiction novel. And so the offer was there, and the huge advantage was that we signed the contract, and 6 months later, this book is coming out. I mean, that's like the kind of turnaround that author wishes for. There's something painful about that interim between the time you sign the contract for a book and the time it comes out. You can't even remember the book anymore. Anyway, but the deal with Audible is that they had a 6-month blackout on print, and so we have we have been shopping the print around and haven't yet found a taker. So maybe that was a bad move, but I'm just a big Audible fan. They've been great for my career, and I am I'm a total Audible head. I'm grandfathered into one of their best deals. I get 2 books a month for some, I will not reveal how little I pay, because I started back in the day. I bought Audible stock before it got bought by Amazon. And so, I'm just in love with the idea of Audible. I'm in love with the idea of audiobooks. Almost all my pleasure reading is Audible audiobooks. And so, that seemed like a good home for me.
So if this deal didn't come about until you were pretty much done with this book, I guess you didn't write the book in any special different way, intending it for it to be an audiobook only? Or?
Absolutely not. Although, I did, did I? Yeah, I recorded Going Deep, myself. But no, I didn't, but this is the thing. Part of my process is that when I get ready to send a story off, one of the last rewrites is an audio rewrite. I mean, I just read it aloud and see how it sounds. And so, my work is, I think, pretty readable in general. Although obviously in this book, there's a couple of info dumps that are technical, but in general, I think my stuff is pretty amenable to audio reading, because that's part of how I decide whether the story's ready to go, is how it sounds right before I send it off.
Yeah, when I'm writing stuff, I always I use text-to-speech software to read everything out loud to me as I'm working on it.
Yeah, and I like that too. Actually, we had this conversation a little bit. I teach at the Stone Coast Creative Writing MFA program, and I often listen to the student manuscripts that way. But it's my own voice that if I hear myself tripping, or the robot doesn't trip over bad grammar, but my voice, I do. When I'm reading along, I say, oh my God, I used the word, fallow 3 times in one paragraph. No, I got to get rid of that, So, that's one of the things that I use the audio for.
Yeah. I also heard you say in an interview that you had Paul Giamatti perform one of your stories.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is back in the distant past. There was a brief shining moment in my career, which I wish had gone on forever, but it didn't happen. Sci-fi.com, back when it was sci-fi.com and not sci-fi, back in the heady days when the internet seemed like the magical carpet ride to success and millions of dollars and fame, they had a show called Seeing Your Theater. And so Seeing Your Theater was audio plays written by science fiction writers, and because sci-fi was downtown in New York, they would just grab actors who are on Broadway or passing through, because an audio play, I did 6 of them, and, I attended 3 or 4 of the shootings. They basically brought these people in for 2 days. And so Paul Giamatti did a story of mine, Campbell Scott, but there was a ton of Brian Denny, not mine, but Brian Denny did them, Claire Bloom, John Turturro, all these people just said, they call them in, they say, we'll drop $1,000 on you for you to walk and record for a day. And so lots of people did it. And so, yeah, it was kind of cool.
So why did the internet not end up being the magic carpet ride to millions?
Well, because they were paying Jim Kelly, some very serious money for a short story, and they were paying Paul Giamatti, blah blah blah, and the suits, the bean counters at Sci-Fi said, "Wait a minute, is this actually getting us any more views, or is this just this little enterprise that is it's fun and it's interesting, but it isn't actually paying off?" And so the bean counters killed it off. It wasn't pulling its weight, and so it went away. And so if you look up Seeing Your Theater, well, the other problem is that, and here's the problem. I wish that it was easily available, but everyone involved there signed a term contract. And so the term ran out. In order for them to continue to play these things, they would have to pay us all again or have us renegotiate the contract. And so it sort of went away. But if you Google senior theater, it's not in the dark net or anything. You can find it, but it's not official. But you can hear stories by, Neil Gaiman and Jim Morrow, John Kessel, Connie Willis. So, some of them are audio versions of actual stories, and some of them are audio originals. And so, yeah, it was a cool thing. But it didn't pay the rent, so it went away.
Yeah. There's a disappointing lack of philanthropy on the part of major corporations, I've found.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine if it's cheap. It doesn't cost them anything, and they can put their brand on it. But what the heck? We live in a capitalist society.
Well, not if Kim Stanley Robinson has anything to do about it.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely.
Well, so you mentioned your new short story collection, The Promise of Space. Why don't you say a bit about what's in this book?
So, this is however many, I guess we're 16 or 14, I can't remember, of my most recent stories. And so a couple years ago, actually 2015, I had this humongous career retrospective, from a small press, Centipede Press, called Masters of Science Fiction, James Patrick Kelly. And they were doing a bunch of science fiction masters. So the Fritz Leiber and it's an ongoing thing, but I was the first live guy. Everyone else was dead. So I was the first live guy they did. And so, it's one thing when you do a Fritz Leiber or Ted Sturgeon or whatever, they have some amazing stories, but they're not writing anymore, but I'm still writing. And so it kind of like spooked me a little bit, like I was putting out my greatest hits album, and so then I'd have to go on the oldies circuit and just sing "Think Like a Dinosaur" 100 times to read "Think Like a Dinosaur" 1,000 times to an audience of aging baby boomers. But I had enough new stories published since then to put out a new collection, and so Sean Wallace at Prime approached me and said, "Hey, what do you think?" And so I was sort of flattered and taken aback. I had 3 other short story collections from Golden Griffin, which I love that company, but they did beautiful books, but they went out of business. And so I had these stories and I thought, yeah, I'd love to do it. So these are all new stories. They're sort of, what I'm thinking of these days. And they're a mixed batch. One of the things that, there's a new story. They insisted on a new story. And so I wrote this fun little story called Yukui. And as I started writing it, as I signed the contract, I thought, oh man, I'm going to put one of my stories in a collection no one's going to read because it's a small press. People are going to read it. Thousands of people, hundreds of people, no, thousands of people are going to read this book. But nonetheless, I thought, well, so I thought, I just write this little, airy story. The more I wrote it, the more happier I got with it. So I really like that story. It will be my newest story when it comes out, and it's something totally different from other stuff I've done. But I have some of my, I've had some luck with Best of the Year anthologies. So several of the stories in this collection have been in Best of the Year anthologies. I guess the most significant story is the last story. It's called The Last Judgment because it's part of, oh no, not again, yes, again. It's part of a fix-up novel that I'm working on. And so I had a novella called Men Are Trouble in Asimov's. And it's the conceit of it is that aliens come tomorrow and decide to improve the human race by disappearing all the men. And so it's a feminist. It's not a post-apocalyptic and it's not a utopia. It's kind of a mess, but it also is a world in which is very much like ours, except no men. And so the women have to reinvent everything. And so The Last Judgment is a novella set in the same universe, actually the same character, just a few years later after Men Are Trouble. And so there'll be one more of those someday, which I'm working on at the moment. And so that will be my next fix-up novel, maybe sometime in the 2018, 2019 range. And so, yeah, but The Promise of Space was a story that actually is one of my favorite stories. It got, it's been anthologized in Best of the Years. And it's told entirely in dialogue, which was a challenge, which I've done before, but I really had a lot of fun with it. It was published in Clarkesworld, and well published indeed. And but if you know the Clarkesworld business model is that all their stories are read by Kate Baker, and so there's an audio version of it as well. And so, but Kate and I are friends, and I proposed to her that we would. It was at the Worldcon in San Antonio that we decided. For my reading, had a reading at the Worldcon. I would invite her in, and we would read that story. It's a two-person story. A astronaut and a dying astronaut and his wife are having a conversation over time. And so Kate and I read that story. It's a very poignant. It has a sort of sad ending. And so we read that story at San Antonio with the idea that we would record it for Clarkesworld, so that when the story came out, it would be the audio version. Well, Kate gave a great performance, and I did my usual hammy James T. Kirk impersonation. But the problem was that in the next room, there was some panel that was funny, and so the wild sound totally ruined it. So, but after we went back home, I recorded my part and sent it to Kate, and she recorded her part, interleaving it because, like I say, it's a conversation, and that came out. It's really a beautiful reading. In some ways, if I was going to recommend anyone look at that story, not that it's not a great story in my collection, The Promise of Space, but the audio of that is really very, very touching and very, very. It's one of my favorite audio projects, and not, like I said, I've done 52 of my own stories. It's probably my favorite audio project of all time.
Well, speaking of James T. Kirk, in that story, you predict that William Shatner will die in 2023.
Oh, did I? I just picked a number out of the hat, Jim. Kirk.
You also have
Shatner.
Oh, you also have Ray Kurzweil being uploaded. I was just curious how you feel about making predictions that could potentially be disproven really quickly, if in the future like that.
Sure. So, dipping back into the far past. I mentioned that I wrote a book called Wildlife. So that was a fix-up novel of stories that were written in the 90s, and the first ones were written in the 90s, and by the time that came out, the Soviet Union still existed, and so when I did the fix-up of it, I had to change all the global politics because in whatever 1989, 1991. I was thinking there'd always be a Soviet Union, of course, and the Soviet Union plays a part in it. So you can't. The thing is, science fiction has a half-life, and the longer a science fiction story exists, the more it devolves into fantasy. That's why you could sort of squint and look at Ray Bradbury's Mars novels, Mars stories, and say, well, that's sort of science fiction. They didn't really know what was going on there. They had a pretty good idea, but nonetheless. But you can only read the Mars books, Bradbury's Mars, as fantasy, in the same way that, one of the most famous lines in science fiction is the opening line of Neuromancer. The sky was the color of a television turned to no channel. And what Gibson meant to say there was that it was kind of gray. But I'm sorry, when your digital television is turned to no channel, it's blue. It's not that gray thing that, it's not static. And so whenever we write science fiction, especially near future science fiction, we are just basically asking for it to go past its sell-by date. And that's just sort of the deal we've got. It occurred to me, I've been thinking about this a lot, especially since I did that retrospective, about how stories age. I mean, some stories age badly because the technology is different. They're still having giant computers in the far on starships in the far distant future. Poor Isaac Asimov's computers of some of his classic stories are huge. Same with Clark. So some age because the technology changes, and some age because mores and the culture changes, and so some of the golden age science fiction, as you well know, does not bear close scrutiny when it comes to gender politics or race politics, and so it's a thing where we're doomed probably to be out of date at some point. That's sort of the deal that we're dealt, and we just sort of have to live with it.
I feel like a lot of authors would keep things vague. They would be intentionally vague about the dates and real people and stuff in order to extend that half-life a little bit.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's one of the things about, Cordwainer Smith is, wow, he still reads great, because who knows when that took place, But yeah, I take your point. But, you're in the moment. I feel like I'm swimming in the popular culture sea, and so I want to touch on as much as I can for the people who are reading it at the moment I'm writing it. I realize I may be shortchanging or turning off readers 30, 40 years in the future, but I sort of feel an obligation to try to reflect the world that I see. Of course, you're writing science fiction, so it's it's in the future. But the fact of the matter is, we have a sort of, one of the things I often play with is we have a sort of assumption, implicit assumption that things will always stay the same as they are. And people always know who Elvis was or who the Beatles were, but how many people know who Benny Goodman is or, Fats Waller? These are things that the iconic, hard to imagine anyone would ever forget people are evanescent as we are. And so I think we can only take a snapshot of the culture we're in and let the future folks look at their footnotes or hyperlinks to find out what the hell we were talking about.
I think that's interesting that with the fix-ups, you are able to go back and tweak the history to make it more current. But then you kind of risk the George Lucas prequels phenomenon, right? Where people have been attached to the version that they, first encountered and really resent having you go and fiddle with it.
Yeah, well, and let me tell you that the Masters of Science Fiction, James Patrick Kelly retrospective collection was a huge problem for me because they wanted a retrospective collection. So they wanted some of the early crappy stories, and they wanted them the way they, so I thought, well, I don't want to publish that. Somebody buys this book, they're going to want to think that the guy who wrote it is a master of science fiction. That guy who wrote those early stories, he was an apprentice. He was doing apprentice work back then. But they wanted to say, oh, yeah, well, he got better, or this was his early, whatever. These were his early concerns. And so I agonized over whether I should rewrite those stories to fix them, at least the technology. And finally I said, look, I have to respect that 23, 27, 30-year-old guy. He did his best, and his stories should be, in the book with my stories too. But, it's a different thing when you're doing a novel and that readers are going to not that they'll write you letters, but that they'll be sort of thrown out of the book. If you're calling, you're saying that the Soviet Union exists in 2017, they say, no, it doesn't. And that guy doesn't know anything, and so slam the book against the wall. So there's a compromise you have to make, I think, when you're doing that kind of work.
Well, actually, speaking of the early stages of your career, in the afterword to The Promise of Space, you say, consider that back in the early 80s, I was called a humanist by my friends, the cyberpunks. I guess you touched on that a little bit, but could you just talk about what was going on with that stuff?
Well, but this is an ancient, and to some extent, the conflict between the humanists and the cyberpunks is an urban legend. But to put it succinctly, there were a bunch of people all the same age who sort of came up at the same time, and they're looking at each other across the tables of content and saying, "What kind of work is he doing? What kind of work is she doing?" And one group of them, mostly quarterbacked by Bruce Sterling, But certainly Bill Gibson and Lou Shiner and Pat Cadigan, not Pat Cadigan so much, although she was dragooned into being a cyberpunk. John Shirley were saying, oh man, those guys over there, they're writing the same old stuff that, Damon Knight wrote and, Kate Wilhelm. We got to have more modern computery, hackery kind of science fiction. So on the other side were people like Stan Robinson and Connie Willis and John Kessel and me and Nancy Kress. I mean, Michael Swanwick certainly was what I would call a humanist, but he sort of like crystallized this moment by writing an essay, which got a lot of attention, called "The User's Guide to the Postmoderns," and he sort of set this conflict up. He sort of said, well, these guys over here, Bruce Sterling says this thing, and Stan Robinson says this thing. Well, I was kind of a bridge person because Bruce and I went to Clarion together. So, I mean, in some ways, Bruce is my oldest writing friend. And so when Bruce started like making this noise, I thought, I can write like Bruce. And so I wrote a bunch of stories that were sort of satirizing the cyberpunks. I mean, my greatest achievement of that mode was I wrote a story called Rat, which got a lot of attention. It got a lot of award nominations, didn't win anything. It got into Ursula Le Guin's Norton Book of Science Fiction. And basically, it's about a drug dealing rat, literally a rat. It's sort of like Stuart Little on drugs. And he's a cyberpunk, but he's also a metaphor because he's a rat. He's a rat. He is selfish and materialistic and not thinking about anything else but himself. And he's a rat. So in the end, he gets killed. And so, but they love that story. Rat was a real cyberpunk story. And so lots of my early cyberpunky stories were sort of like tweaking the cyberpunk, saying, come on, guys, are you serious about this? But as time went on, I was certainly persuaded by their fixation on two things: the cybernetic, the computer revolution, the digital revolution, and the trend toward transhumanism. So lots of cyberpunks are altering themselves. They're altering themselves, sometimes biologically, sometimes mechanically, sometimes as cyborgs. And I think they were onto something, and that was something worth paying attention to, as certainly was the digital revolution, which certainly changed everything. And so before very long, with a few notable exceptions, all the cyberpunks and all the humanists were pals, workshopping together, talking about, stuff. My friend John Kessel, who was a proto-humanist, and my friend Lou Shiner both live in Raleigh, North Carolina. They workshop together, lo these many years later. And so the war, between the cyberpunks and the humanists was more in the propaganda than in reality.
Right, because it seems like if you look at Hollywood science fiction like Steven Spielberg or something, it always has this very conservative worldview where what really matters is love and family, and
right.
The human spirit is special. And it seems to me that science fiction at its best is questioning all that stuff and saying, are we going to have the same sort of families in the future? Could you just rewrite, your brain and it would completely change your personality, and there's nothing special about your spirit that would prevent that from happening, things like that.
Right. But Bruce would come to Sycamore Hill, the Sycamore Hill Writers Workshop, which was a bunch of young, ambitious writers. It still goes on, but back in the day, Bruce and Karen Fowler and Maureen McHugh and John Kessel and Walter John Williams, all these people. And Bruce used to have a thing that actually stuck with me. He said, one of the things that science fiction needs to do is burn the motherhood statement. And what I took that to mean was, motherhood is good, right? Isn't that written in the, fabric of the universe? But when you start questioning the basic assumptions, which I think some of the thrust of Western culture, Western technological culture, is questioning some of the basic assumptions. when you start burning the motherhood statement and seeing what's left, it leads to some very interesting speculation about what life might be like in the future. Burning the motherhood statement is, to me, sort of goes to the idea that most people, I believe, would regard, having your brain uploaded into a computer with disgust or horror. But consider the alternative. The alternative is that you're dead. And if in fact you were uploaded into a computer, yeah, it wouldn't be you exactly because you wouldn't have a body, but it would be some fraction of you, and maybe people would be happy with that. And so when you start questioning the assumptions of what it means to be human or what's important about being human, with that sort of ruthless, ethical, cleansing away all the assumptions about, what is really important, you get to some interesting and I think telling speculation about, if not where we're going, at least where we need to avoid going.
Well, right, like in your story Declaration, it's about some teenagers who are advocating for their right to stay in virtual reality permanently and not be forced to spend any time out of it.
Yep. And that's certainly, thank you. That's exactly what that story is about. That story is about a couple of things. That story is about, the probably a good thing, but the widespread notion that we shouldn't let our kids play too many video games because they should be out in the sun, basking and swimming and jumping rope and playing hopscotch, and not, playing Call of Duty or, whatever, Skyrim. Okay, yeah, okay, I agree. That's probably right for us. Maybe in the future, not so much, because it may be a viable kind of escape for people who have no other economic way to get out of what could be a very drudgery of their lives and the horror of their lives. But in Declaration, one of the characters is handicapped, is disabled. And so in virtuality, he is able to do things that he can't do in meat space, in real life. And so why should we tell him that he shouldn't be in virtuality all the time when he's happier in virtuality than he is suffering in his body? He suffered from a industrial accident, I believe. I can't remember what I did. Something like that, though. He's in pain, but when he's in virtuality, he's not in a crumpled body, and he's not in pain. So
it was a terrorist attack, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, that's right, a terrorist attack. Yeah. So so that's the argument I make there. Some people said, "Oh, well, he's just playing the whole time," and I didn't. I had it in the back of my mind. He was actually doing stuff. He wasn't just playing. He was like inventing stuff. But I never actually got that into the story. If I was to rewrite that story, which I'm not going to, but if I do another iteration of that idea, I would be much more interested in what it's like to actually live in that virtual world. If to escape from our world, what would people be doing? I don't think they would be just playing. They'd be doing other stuff. They'd be creating stuff. Maybe they'd be playing the stock market or whatever. They'd have jobs in virtuality, and there'd be nothing wrong with that.
One point I thought was really interesting that these teenagers make is that they're not consuming resources, natural resources, by being in virtual reality at the same rate as people who are like owning houses and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think they make a good argument because they're making my argument. It's another thing about this is that, in a material world, we are programmed to seek pleasure, to seek happiness, to seek more, basically. When you get something, you're happy for a while, but then you're not. I mean, that happiness goes away. And so then you want something else. So you get a new bike, and you ride it for a while. That's great. It's super duper. But, I could have had that other bike. And so then, okay, I'll get that bike. And so, but this consuming ethic, is croaking the planet. And so in virtuality, it's not going to cost you anything to get a better bike or to get a better house or to get a better boyfriend, whatever. Those things are, it's a scarcity-free society in virtuality, and we are destroying the planet, trying to get more and more and more to fulfill the things that we think we want to get whatever happiness we're chasing.
Yeah. I was also really curious about this in your story, One Sister, Two Sister, Three. There's this section about religious experience and how you would induce it in people. Could you talk about sort of the research behind that?
Yeah. That's a sub theme. So I went to Catholic school, K through college. And so, I have a lot of I'm still working through that religious experience from all those years. I am not a believer at the moment. I probably will never be a believer, but I'm very interested in the religious experience. And so, one of the things that I was looking at was, I did this research a while ago, but there has been research into what parts of the brain might be, neurologists are interested. Well, where does this religious impulse come from? Where does God live in the brain? And so they've been trying to explore by stimulating different parts of the brain to see whether they can create the experience of a religious experience or the experience of communing with God. And so they poked and prodded and stimulated lots of different parts of the brain. And you can look this up because this is actual research that is done. And ultimately they decided there is no one part of the brain. People said, oh, well, if we knew where this part of the brain was, if we knew what neurons to stimulate, then we'd understand where religion comes from. But in fact, it's not a stimulation thing that now people think there's not one part of the brain that needs to be stimulated. It is that all parts of the brain need to be dampened. And so in that moment, it's possible that there'll be this experience of transcendence, whether you call it God or some other mystical, experience. But, the materialist view is, which is a science, which in general, I believe, is a science fiction view, and that is that the brain is a system that all of human experience exists in the brain. What is not in the brain is not human. There is no higher power. There's no soul. And so if we're going to figure out why there is religion, it has to be someplace. It has to be some brain function which is worth looking for. And so people are still at it, and with no notable success. Although they have concocted different explanations for what it might be about, but they really don't know.
Well, right. The way I read it in your story was that basically we have this sense of identity, which I think we know from neuroscience is sort of a simulation or an illusion.
Right.
And when that gets messed with or suppressed, then that's when you sort of start to feel like you're one with the universe, when your sense of identity is kind of being tamped down.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of fun fact about James Patrick Kelly. I'm a meditator. So I meditate twice a day. And I very rarely achieve nirvana, but I do I do when I'm having a very good meditation sort of disappear. So the thoughts that I have are sort of like clouds passing over that they don't really mean anything. And that's sort of one of the goals of anyway, my meditation practice. Not to be involved with your own thoughts, to sort of watch your thoughts happen. And so in that way, you can sort of sense that some of the things that you think are important in your life are actually, if you stand back and watch them, you can just see that they're just neurons firing. And so, what you said.
Does meditation in any way help you come up with story ideas, or is that kind of the opposite of coming up with story ideas?
Oh, it's the hardest thing. So here's the deal. I am a headlight writer, and so I depend on my subconscious to plot my stories. And so it often happens that when I'm getting close to the end of a story or a novel, I will wake up in the middle of the night and write, 3 pages of stuff that just came to me in the middle of the night. And it's really hard because meditation puts me in that same, my subconscious, lights up when I meditate. And so all of a sudden I'm sitting there, I'm watching my thoughts pass. Oh my God, that's the end of the story right there. and then I'm in the struggle. Is that really the end of the story? Or am I just like trying not to meditate? Because that's sometimes, sometimes your mind will try to stop your meditation. Sometimes though, I just have to stop the freaking meditation and write the idea down because it's brilliant, or it's, the subconscious has knitted together a bunch of disparate things that exist in the story and say, that's why the gun is on the mantelpiece in scene 3. It's got to be used to kill the alien in the last scene. Oh yeah, of course. And so, but meditation is very good for that, except it's very annoying for that. And those moments are not ubiquitous. They're almost always at the end of a project where I'm just sort of like, I'm trying to wrap things up. I'm trying to understand what the thematic content of the story is, and these little midnight, messages or meditation messages come to me, and I use them as. Sometimes you write those things down, and the next morning they don't make any sense, or you can't read your writing. But mostly they're not as good as you thought they are. But I would say 60 to 70% of them go straight into the stories.
Actually, speaking of guns on mantelpieces, you've got some guns on the mantelpiece in the Last Judgement story you mentioned, where it's the world without men.
Yeah.
And you say that the guns are only on mantelpieces because women just don't really have an interest in having guns. I was just curious how, if you think that's what would actually happen in a world without men.
I think so. And one of the reasons why it's not only that they don't want to have guns, it is that there was revulsion about, so when all the men disappeared, the society collapsed, and the aliens who were trying to improve society realized they made a horrible mistake because some women used many guns that were extant to kill each other, to kill themselves. Suicide rates were astonishingly high. And so there's sort of been a revulsion against guns only because of that horrific, the crazy time it's called, which is basically a kind of Holocaust of women where even though all the men disappeared, another 30% of the women died in suicide or gunfights and stuff like that. So that's sort of the idea there. But I do think that, my gun-toting women friends are going to, send me email on this one. But I do think in general that guns are a guy thing, and it would be easier for women to eschew firearms than it would be for men.
I guess I've only read this story. I haven't read the other sort of stories in this sequence, but is your society, do you sort of see that for the most part that the women would just kind of fill all the niches left behind by the men disappearing, or is this society dramatically different than our society?
I think so. This is the thing. This is the $64,000 question here. I think that what's happened in this society is that women are yes, society is that they grew up in. The grannies, as I call them, the people who were alive when the men disappeared, who still remember men, are still shaping the society. And so, because of that, there are functions that society has, that culture has called for, that men normally did or typically did, whether that was right or not, that women now are migrating to do. So, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, this is a hard-boiled PI novel. The stories will be a novel, and so this is a very Raymond Chandler-esque, hard-bitten, hard-boiled woman who solves murders. Not to say that there can't be certainly there's some amazing women detective writers writing great women's detective fiction, or detective fiction with women, detectives. But the other thing is that there are. I think one of the things that's going on in this story that is going to be that is part of the final novella. So in this story, there's a lot of trans women becoming trans men, and so what is that about? And why is there more? The story posits that there'd be more of them than there are in our society. So why is that? But in the final book, the aliens realize their mistake, and they start allowing boys to be born. And so the third novella is about what would boys be like brought up in a society where women were the dominant gender. And so that's sort of what kind of men would those boys become? And so that's sort of the question I'm asking in the third book, because the way the book is structured is that the women's society really can't exist without the aliens propping them up. The aliens are propping them up by, they've created these bots to sort of do all the stuff that some to sort of fill up the functions of the economy that needed to be done in order for the economy to work. And they're also seeding the women so that they're having girl babies so that the population doesn't decline, because there is some but not extensive in vitro fertilization that the women are doing to the women, but there's not enough to replace the population. So I didn't want that. That's not a sustainable, shall we say, idea. At least for me, I wanted to get to a point where humanity, femininity, the women and the men, women and the boys who are to come would reestablish a new society. What would that society be like? And that's where the book is headed in that third novella, which I'm probably about 20,000 words into 40,000 word novella.
You say in the afterword that writing these stories have, quote, led you to confront lifelong prejudices about gender identity?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the things that that thinking yourself into other people's heads changes the way you think about people who aren't you. And so it's been a lifelong process of, first of all, learning to think about what women, writing convincing women characters, female characters, women characters. Writing convincing women has been sort of on my agenda for the last 20, 30 years. But, I didn't really know a whole lot of people intimately who are trans. And so I have some, my daughter, Maura Kelly, is a professor of sociology at Portland State University, and she's very active in the LGBT community. And so I've met lots of her friends, and I have actually bounced some of these stories off some of her friends who are some people who are trans, and so I'm continuing on in that sort of process of sort of exploring. I don't want to do cultural appropriation in this, because I understand that that's a problem, but I also am very interested in it because part of the science fiction agenda, as I've been saying in other stories, is that we can mess with our bodies. Aside from reassigning gender, we may be reassigning brain states or body parts and stuff like that. So this is part of, it seems to me, what the future is about. And so it's worth interrogating some of the assumptions that I have and that the society has about what it's like to be different, about the other, and how do we accommodate the other when they have needs that are different than ours.
Yeah. I just really want to ask you about this story, The Chimp of the Pope. So it looks like it appeared in a Robert Silverberg tribute anthology.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and of course, Silverberg's famous story is The Pope with the Chimps. And so, you know, it came from the sort of wacky title, and then it evolved into some of my thinking about the singularity. And so it seems to me, and I've written about this several times, essays, the logical, outcome of the cyberpunk technology is the singularity. The closer we get to to surfing the interwebs, to putting ourselves into cyberspace, the more likely we are to actually get to this sort of idea that we could all live in cyberspace. Well, we could all live in, as they do in Declaration, in virtuality, and then what do we need to meet for? And then who are we? And so in The Pope of the Chimps, there's anthropologists who are looking at a chip society, and they realize that the chimps have sort of formed a religion. And in the Chip of the Popes, all the humans have. Most of the humans have uploaded and disappeared, and those remaining don't really know what happened to them. But before the humanity disappeared into the singularity, they upgraded the chimps, so the chimps now are actually running a chimp culture, and so they are also looking for. They are observing the remaining humans who also seem to be forming a new religion, the religion of the singularity, and the popes are in my story are these people who believe they're delusional, and they're delusional because they were left behind by humanity, and then all of a sudden somebody who claims to be a real pope comes along and says, well, you people who have these delusions of grandeur, you actually are great people. You are the humans, and there is a religion. It's the religion of the singularity, and so we should pay attention to it. And which means to the chimps that maybe the few remnants of humans may come back and take their world back. When so there's a culture war there between the two.
Yeah. So other than just the premise, did you try to make the story Silverbergian in any other way?
No, not really. Bob Silverberg and I love Bob Silverberg. He's great. He's a touchstone for my career. When I was coming up, we used to say, Kessel and I used to say, for instance, like, well, if we had anyone's career, we want Bob Silverberg's career because, the man is not afraid to write science fiction. He's not afraid to write literary fiction. He's not afraid to write what some people might call blasphemous fiction. He'll do anything, and he's not tied down by the constraints of he expands the genre instead of being limited by it. He pushes out against the edges of it and makes it bigger. So we were totally into it. And so one of the things I think that Bob Silverberg is very interested in is this whole notion of religion and how religion functions in society. And so if there's anything Silverbergian about it, aside from the twist on the title, it's thinking very hard about religion and how religion works its way into our relations with one another.
Yeah. Do you know Silverberg well? Because I know he goes to all the conventions.
I know Bob fairly well. I should probably stop telling this story, but I'm going to anyway. So I was a huge Robert Silverberg fanboy. And the first time I ever actually met him in person was on a panel. And so I was probably 30-something, not published, but not well published. And so I show up for this panel, and as was my wont in those days, I want to sit at the end and maybe sort of hunker down so no one will see me because I don't really have a whole lot to say. And so I sat one from the end, and then Silverberg came in at the very end and sat down right next to me. Right next to me, Bob Silverberg, holy smokes. It's like, my idol. And so I summoned up my courage and say, well, Mr. Silverberg, I said something like, I'm one of your biggest fans. And he says, well, if you know Bob Silverberg, he's a very urbane and calm and very, very smart person. So he said, well, that's very nice. That's very nice. Yeah, thank you. Which is a super thing to say. By the way, if you ever come up to me, don't tell me I'm one of your favorite authors, even if I am. Tell me something about one of the stories. I got nothing. There's no place to go when you say, oh, I'm your biggest fan. You're one of my favorite authors. What is the author supposed to say next? So Silverberg handled it with aplomb. The panel hasn't started, and I'm sitting next to Silverberg. I should say something. I said, well, Mr. Silverberg, I should tell you that I bought your book, The Man in the Maze, back in 73, whatever it was. It was the first book I ever bought with my own, with my allowance when I was 11. And he looked at me. He said, Jim, I will thank you never to mention this again. And of course, I've told this story a gajillion times. But so now I'm embarrassed. Now I'm embarrassed. But I saved the day because The Man in the Maze is a very interesting book about telepathy, and it's about a guy who has been captured by aliens and made into a telepath so they could talk to them, so they could talk to humans, but he can't stop broadcasting. So wherever he goes, all of his thoughts, all of his desires, all of his subconscious, the ugliness of him projects. And so he's so horrifically, it so horrifies people that they strand this guy in a maze, so people won't have to listen to his thoughts broadcasting all the time. And so then later on, the aliens come back, and so they have to fetch him out of the maze so they can talk to the aliens. Well, I told Bob that I had realized in college that The Man in the Maze was a take on the legend of Philoctetes. And Philoctetes was one of the Greeks who went on to the Trojan Wars, and he did something bad, and so the gods punished him by making him stink. And so he stunk so bad that the Greeks abandoned him on an island. They cast him away. And they got to, later on when they're fighting Troy, there was a prophecy that says, you will never conquer Troy until you bring the Philoctetes to Troy. And so the Agamemnon says Ulysses back to the island to fetch Philoctetes, who doesn't want to come because they've abandoned him because he stank so much. But Silverberg, nobody's ever recognized that before. So yes, all right, I'm back in. So Bob and I have we're pretty good friends. Bob has a tradition on the night of the Hugo Awards that he invites a bunch of people to go out to dinner with him. And so we usually go out to dinner before the Hugo. So it's like me and Connie Willis and Stan Robinson, sometimes George R. R. Martin, sometimes Nancy Kress. I'm not going to get to see him in Helsinki. I'm not going, but I was there last year. We had the dinner last year.
That's interesting because I haven't read The Man in the Maze, but it sounds like almost the mirror image idea of dying inside, where it's too much telepathy versus
not enough.
Too little.
Yeah, and dying inside is it's the touchstone for me as a young writer was like, wow, you can do that. You can actually write a story in which the superpower is going away. No science fiction writer would ever write about telepathy fading. It was all be about having the telepathy and having a superpower. And this other thing was, I thought it was really great. It was sort of what one of the reasons why many of us loved Bob from the get-go.
Yeah. All right, so we need to start wrapping this up pretty soon, but I did want to give you a chance to talk about the Stone Coast program and just MFAs a little bit. I don't know if you got a chance to check out.
Did.
Yeah.
I listened to a previous one of your podcasts about professors dis fantasy. And all the women, I believe, I have met at ICFA, were Dell Awards winners. Maybe not one of them. The two of them I had already met. So I listened to it with great, what shall I say? I felt bad for them because they should have come to Stone Coast. So the gist of this program of the podcast, which you all should go listen to, it's really good, was that these women, mostly in undergrads, were discriminated against for the content of their fiction because they were writing fantasy. Most of them, I think, were writing fantasy. They may have been writing science fiction too. But the writing professors said, "Oh no, that's crap. You should be writing that." And all I wanted to say as I was listening, I was actually driving up. I'm at Stone Coast. I'm about to start teaching tomorrow. So I was driving up. I just wanted to say, lack of imagination. Don't listen to that person. They're idiots. Any writer who purports to be a teacher of creative writing these days, who is saying that science fiction and fantasy isn't worth writing, is an idiot. Not only is an idiot, he's not paying attention to the trends in the culture. But I absolutely recognize that there is that kind of prejudice out there. And what's interesting to me is that prejudice exists more strongly in the creative writing part of the English departments than it does in the English department, the literature part of the English departments. I think we've won the war in the literature side, but I think the creative writing battle goes on. And so there's still a lot of idiots out there who will tell you that, science fiction and fantasy isn't real literature. But I have to say one thing though about this, and that is, it's true, however, that science fiction and fantasy is harder to write and it's easier to fail at because at least, in a mainstream literature, literary fiction, you basically have to do a plot and character and setting. And the setting is given to you. I mean, it's your setting. And plot and character are people or people you can imagine. But a lot of science fiction and fantasy falls down in the world building part of the process. And I can understand why people, a writing teacher would say, well, I don't know, why aren't the wizards in charge? I mean, they're magical. They can conjure. And the fact of the matter is, unless you sort of build a consistent world when you're doing a fantasy story or a science fiction story, how are these matter transmitters actually working? You don't necessarily need the technology. You don't need a schematic diagram, but you need to think about what can they do and what can't they do. One of the things we say in writing workshops is that when everything is possible, nothing is interesting. And so I think that's one of the places where certainly aspiring science fiction or fantasy writers fall down is that maybe they got their characters and plot all together, but their world building kind of is wonky and it throws writers out of their stories. So Stone Coast is a creative writing MFA program here in Maine, and it consists of 4 genres. Their notion of genre is a little bit different than ours, but our 4 genres are poetry, creative nonfiction, literary fiction, or what they just call fiction, and popular fiction. So in the popular fiction side, we have a bunch of really amazing writers who teach science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, historical, all the kinds of things that some people sort of push to the side and saying, oh, that's genre writing. And so detective thrillers, that kind of thing. So, I mean, we have Nancy Holder, David Anthony Durham, Liz Hand, Dora Gosme. And so when you come to Stone Coast, you're probably going to want to write some kind of genre, and you come to the popular fiction track, you're probably going to write some kind of science fiction or fantasy or thriller or detective or whatever, crime, romance. And we will take you seriously. You'll get an MFA, but more important, you'll get, the kind of feedback that some kinds of writing programs can't give you because they just don't know what's this world building thing about, or they're going to look down their nose at the at some of the formula of romance, or they recoil at some of the ickiness of horror, and so they can't talk about it. Well, we can talk about anything that you can write here.
And it's a low residency MFA program?
That's right. So twice a year in July and January, the student body and the faculty gathers for 10 days. And then we workshop our brains out, and there's lectures and readings and schmoozing. And as in any kind of, workshop-y experience, workshopping this actual stories, talking about the stories is very important. But there's also that sort of best practices, late at night kind of chit chat, or where do you send this thing, or how does Stan Robinson do it, or how does Dora Goss do it, kind of thing that is helpful too. It's sort of an immersive 10 days, and you come out of it, your head is going to blow up. It's, I've taught Clarion a lot. I've taught, 10, 12 times. It's like Clarion, except because Clarion is 6 weeks. This is 10 days times 2 times 4. So, it's a little bit longer than Clarion, but it's also spread out over more time. But it's that same sort of thing where you're totally bombarded. You can't, some people don't sleep at night. They're still, working over all the things that they've heard and applying it to their own fiction or their careers. And so it's a very good thing. And so we've had some amazing people, come out of here, Murr Lafferty and Sandra McDonald, J.M. McDermott, and Bonnie Jo Stufflebeam. Right now, this year, Brenda Cooper, who actually just came so she could get her ticket, her MFA. She'd already published a bunch of stuff, but, like 5 or 6 novels. And Mikey Rosner-Herman, another one who came, well-published writers who just wanted to get an MFA so they could teach themselves. And so, yeah, it's a very good program.
I mean, after we did that fantasy versus professors versus fantasy panel, I was thinking about doing a follow-up kind of best colleges for fantasy writers sort of thing. And so I've been trying to gather info on that. And my take on it, it seems like if you're writing stuff kind of more in a Kelly Link sort of vein, there are a reasonable number of options for you. But if you want to write like something in a George R. R. Martin, Stephen King, Ian M. Banks kind of vein, I don't know that there's too many options.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think that there's no way to know until you actually get there. One of the ways to know, though, is to look at the faculty and see if anyone's published science fiction or fantasy. Because there are a lot of schools where there are faculty members who are actually publishing. This is going to sound like I'm not tolerant, but if you're an undergrad, you want to write science fiction or fantasy, you really can't get the kind of information, the kind of feedback you want, unless you're workshopping with someone who's actually publishing science fiction or fantasy, or crime, or romance, or whatever. Because there are general helps, general techniques that any writing professor could give you, but your responsibilities, your remit is much more specific and detailed, and you need that kind of feedback that only someone who knows the field and who is publishing in the field can give you. And the sad fact of the matter is a lot of people who publish, who teach writing are lightly published, if published at all, or they're published a little bit, but they're not working writers, they're teaching writers. And so, this is a problem with all writing programs, is how qualified is the writing teacher to teach you about the kind of writing you want to do?
Yeah. All right, so Jim, we are way out of time here. So, sure. Do you just have any final thoughts? Anything else you didn't get a chance to mention?
No, this is going to sound sort of self-serving, but I love your podcast. I mean, I think that this whole podcast. Here's the thing. Recently, we just did the thing about the Canadian television show Prisoners of Gravity. There is a bunch of people on that who are no longer around, who are we now know what they thought about some of these things. And so this podcasts like this, one hopes that they are preserved because someday, maybe not me, but some of the people you've had on are going to be important to know what they had to say, and so this sort of, it's a fun thing to talk to you and it's a fun thing to listen now, but I'm also thinking of the future, graduate students of the 23rd century will be like digging through these old podcasts and, oh my God, is that what Dora Goss really thought when she was writing, the Alchemist's Daughter thing? Yeah. Anyway, so that's what I like to say. Thank you for doing this. It's not only fun, but it's also, I think, part of the culture of our genre.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one thing that's nice that I own this podcast and I control it. It's never going to end up in a situation like Prisoners of Gravity where the people who made it would like it to be released, but there's all sorts of legal entanglements that's making that difficult. So certainly I'll do everything I can to make sure that these episodes, especially as I was telling you how much work I put into each one, I don't want them just disappearing.
I get it. I totally get it.
But I have to say, Jim, I think you're important, and I'm really glad we got to hear what you had to say. So
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was fun.
All right, so we've been speaking with James Patrick Kelly, and his new books are Mother Go and The Promise of Space. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Yep, thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to James Patrick Kelly for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Jason Leffler, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.